everybody. Welcome back to another installment of the comprehensive yet informal study of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, his masterwork, a foundational piece, I suppose, of modern philosophy. Today we're going over the Transcendental Exposition of the Concept of Space. It is just me today, no Patrick or anybody else, unfortunately, but I do understand. You can see the date here, new year around the holidays, people still, doing things like that, I suppose. So yeah, just me today, just getting this done nice and quick, so next time we can move into on time. But today we'll just finish covering the space. Lots of this was the meat, I want to say, of this was covered. Of Kant's theory of space was covered in the last installment of the study, so go see that if you haven't already. But today we're going to be doing the Transcendental Exposition, which is a bit shorter. And I suppose we'll do the. Shall we do the conclusions? You know what? No, I think we can save the conclusions for next time. That it's a rather large piece. Yeah, and that is going to. Yeah, that's a bit beefy. We'll save that for next time. Today we'll just do the Transcendental Exposition of the Concept of Space. So it's a bit short and sweet, but still important. So let's hop into it and find out why. So Kant says here, I understand by a transcendental exposition the explanation of a concept as a principle from which insight into the possibility of other synthetic a priori cognitions can be gained. So it's a bit of a beefy sentence, as most things in Kant are, but basically this can be understood by trying to understand what the goal of, or at least the stated alleged goal, right, of this work is, as stated by Kant, and that is namely to explain how synthetic a priori cognitions are possible. So basically what he wants to do is a popular phrase in Kantian works, scholarship, just Kant studies in general, is like preconditions, right? The preconditions for whatever. It's Kant's looking for the preconditions necessary for synthetic a priori cognitions. And he's basically saying that transcendental exposition is basically a concept that serves as a principle that can give us insight into the possibility. So it's basically something that's going to figure out how synthetic a priori cognitions are gained. So that's generally what he means by transcendental exposition. And as we can see here, it's the transcendental exposition of space. So we're going to go on in a bit to, you could put it together. Really, what we can expect in this section is explaining how space can give us insight into how synthetic a priori conditions can be gained. So with that being said and understood, let us continue. For this aim, it is required, 1, that such cognitions actually flow from the given concept, and 2, that these cognitions are only possible under the presupposition of a given way of explaining this concept. So we have two requirements here for transcendental exposition basically to work. So the first one, cognitions need to flow from the given concept. So basically things need to be cognized out of that concept. And then number 2, these cognitions are only possible under the presupposition of a given way of explaining this concept. So basically there has to be something presupposing it that can explain it. Basically it has to be explainable under some presupposed way. So these are the two requirements. 1, that cognitions actually flow from it, and 2, there needs to be some presumed way of that the concept is explained under. So the concept has to be explained through presupposition, and then the cognition actually has to be caused by that concept that is explained, the presupposition. So with all that understood, now that we have a good grasp of what transcendental exposition is and what is required of it, we can go into now and apply that to space. So let's go ahead. Geometry is a science that determines the properties of space synthetically and yet a priori. Um, and just a reminder that synthetic a priori is, I probably should have said this up here, but this is something huge, turning point in philosophy. Uh, Rationalists and empiricists kind of had nailed down various judgments, which we explained earlier, but they're analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori, and they're the two separate judgments really that modern philosophy had figured out. And then Kant introduces the third synthetic a priori, which basically means necessary, but not by definition. By rather perhaps seemingly arbitrarily thrown together concepts, but thrown together in such a necessary way, but isn't derived from their definition. So this is a huge huge discovery in philosophy, if it is valid. So, and then as immediately people want to say, oh, give me an example of something synthetic a priori, because that seems so strange to me. So Kant says, here we go. We're gonna talk about space, right? Space determine geometry is science that well, I guess maybe not space. So not space really in the natural scientific way, right? Not something like Newtonian physics space, or I don't know, another sort of physical space, but rather the more abstract geometrical space, right? Geometry describes the space that Kant is talking about. And it does it in such a way that is synthetic and a priori, and that's huge. So let's go into to see how he explains that. So he goes on to say, what then must the representation of space be for such a cognition of it to be possible? It must originally be intuition. For from a mere concept, no propositions can be drawn that go beyond the concept, which, however, happens in geometry. And this was covered in the introduction, which we have covered early in the series as well, specifically in the 5th section of the introduction. But this intuition must be encountered in us a priori, that is, prior to all perception of an object, thus must be pure, not empirical intuition. For geometrical propositions are all apodeictic, that is, combined with consciousness of their necessity, e.g. space has only 3 dimensions, but such propositions cannot be empirical or judgmental experience, nor inferred from them, which is also something, this is also something that can be found in the introduction. So what is Kant saying here? Kant is saying space is a priori, and so earlier, back in these sections, right, Kant gives a bunch of arguments, and if you saw from last time, Patrick and I were going a bit back and forth. They're a bit controversial, maybe not so solid, but I believe I brought up an argument about kind of space being just kind of inherently universal and necessary in all of experience, and I think that's what really Kant is saying here. This intuition must be encountered a priori, prior to all perception of an object. This must be pure, right? To even have an object, right, in space must exist. For an object to have space itself, right? Objects are made up of, they take up space, right? That they're spatial and temporal, which we'll see, right? All objects are spatio-temporal, and we'll get into time a bit later. But at least the space, right? We can say that safely. It is necessary. It is, that they take up space, and it's an intuition, right? It has to do with objects. Intuition means the cognition relating to objects, and Kant believes that intuition is received, whereas concepts are kind of purely of the mind, spontaneously. He describes them as. But intuitions are not that, right? And concepts don't have to do with objects. They are sort of things of themselves, and they get applied to intuitions to give us experience, as that was also explained in the introduction, as were these other things. But intuitions, right? So so space is sort of the a priori intuition. Well, maybe not the, right? Spoiler alert, time is also the other one that Kant identifies. But for at least up to this point, it is sort of the one that we've seen so far, right? The intuition that is a priori. It relates to objects, but it's necessary. And how do you know it's necessary? it's you know, for anything to be possible, it is universal across experience that space is possible. Um, you can't really have anything, right, or even not experience, right? It's not empirical judgment of experience. I was sort of just giving an example of like spatial objects to illustrate how you can see how it might be intuited. But Kant goes a step further and says that space itself is just necessary, and that's sort of just something that it's prior to all perception of an object. Thus, it must be pure, not empirical intuition. It is a bit controversial, right? Because this would lead to what he was saying before. You can imagine space without object, and Kant makes that claim. Is that really true? It's debatable. Maybe not, but at the very least, I think it can be strongly argued that he does have a point in saying that it is a necessary for experience, which is really another thing that this critique of pure reason, this work, is set out to do, right? Describe the preconditions. There's that word again, right? The preconditions of experience. And I think it can be argued that space isn't necessary because to even have experience at all, we need space and time. And even though we can't, even Kant will argue that we can imagine those things on their own. Even if you can't really take them away and have experience, right? It's not really, that's sort of absurd to imagine. And so that's really the angle I think that is really helpful to understand and accept to some extent Kant's argument. Maybe you don't have to go as radical as he does here, saying that, prior to all perception of an object, but in practical experience, everything has space, and there's nothing that will ever be imaginable in perceived experience that can be without space, right? Perception doesn't even work without space, and I think that's at least safe to say. So all that being said, let's see. All apodeictic, combined with one consciousness of their necessity. Space only has three dimensions, but such pure judgments are referred from. And right, geometrical propositions, right? They're a priori. And okay, so hopefully you can buy at least to some extent that space is a priori, at least for the possibility of experience, or just go all the way with Kant and just say they're a priori in general, regardless of taking any perception into account. I'm not sure if you could do that though, because he does sort of say a priori. He says that is prior to all perception. So maybe imagining perception is necessary for understanding that. I'm not sure. That's a little niche thing. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, okay, a priori, right? Even if you don't buy it, whatever, at least for the sake of understanding the argument, okay, a priori, fine. But what is really synthetic about this? He hasn't really, I think, given in this paragraph too much to happen, other than kind of just mentioning geometry, right? Which he takes as synthetic. That is the in the introduction. Now, I don't have the introduction sections memorized, so I don't really know if he says that there, that in these specific parts that geometry is synthetic. But in the introduction, you can look back, and I do remember this clearly. He makes it a point that mathematics, for him, are synthetic. That's quite a controversial claim, but it's huge and it's foundational for this argument. So understanding how space is synthetic, geometrical space that is a priori for Kant, understanding why it's synthetic has to do with the fact that it's geometrical, and it's a priori because for perception to even be possible, space needs to happen, right? And we'll see time later as well. Yeah, I am a little caught up on this. I'm wondering if you can, because before he's saying you can sort of, without imagining any objects, imagine space. But then he's also defining like the a priori nature of space prior to perception of object. So, I wonder if you always have to be thinking about perception and what comes before it. Well, even if, yeah, I don't know. I think it is necessary for perception, whether it's before or sort of maybe something simultaneous, up in the air at least for now. Anyone wants to comment and give some insight on that would be helpful and enjoyed, and always love some discussion on this. But anyway, so for Kant, at the very least, whether or not you agree with it, geometry makes it synthetic, and it's a priori because it's prior to all perception, and therefore it's pure, not empirical. So there we go. Okay, moving on. Now, how can an outer intuition inhabit the mind that precedes the objects themselves, and in which the concept of the latter can be determined a priori? Obviously not otherwise than insofar as it has its seat merely in the subject, as its formal constitution for being affected by objects and thereby acquiring immediate representation, that is, intuition of them, thus only as the form of outer sense in general. I'm just going to look that over again for a second. Outer intuition inhabit the mind. He seems to be saying something about. Okay. So I think to understand this, we need to point out something about Kant's philosophy that will become more clear later on, because Kant thinks there is this world of objects in themselves that are separate from cognition, because cognition happens. Well, okay, so it's sort of related to cognition, but only in the sense that objects are received. So objects for us, right, that we see in our experience, they are not objects in themselves for Kant. Kant believes objects come from this, so to speak, noumenal realm. He'll dub it later, and we'll go into that much later in the critique. We'll see that. And he believes that objects are received via intuition, and then we apply concepts to them. And he says here, in which the concept of the latter can be determined a priori. So it seems to me that he's asking, how can an outer intuition have the mind? So he seems to be questioning his own system here. It seems to me, I could be wrong about this, but the way I'm reading it, it seems to be he's questioning, if the only way we know of objects, right, are through a mix of intuitions and concepts, how can an outer intuition inhabit the mind that precedes the objects themselves? So how can so to speak, the noumenal mind, how can the noumenal mind cognize these objects, to which the concepts we have of these objects are determined necessarily? So basically, how are these objects made before we apply concepts to them? That's how I'm reading this. I could be wrong, but let's see. Obviously not otherwise than merely in the subject. Formal constitution be affected by objects. Obviously no. This formal constitution for being affected by objects and their outer. Oh wait, never mind. Okay. Okay, so never mind. I think he is talking about. Well, that would be an interesting question, right? So maybe don't forget about that. That is something interesting. If Kant is right, then how are these objects produced? What noumenal mind is producing them? I believe that does get asked later on, and I don't believe the answer is very satisfying, but we'll get there. At least in my opinion, that's to say. But I think all Kant is saying here is basically I don't think it's anything very big. I think he's already said this. I think it's, and I guess it would be very Kantian of him because Kant does like to repeat things. Basically, Kant is saying, at least how I'm reading it, is that the subject is affected by the object, acquiring immediate representation, that is intuition. So only if form outer sense. So basically, the subject acquires an immediate representation, that is the intuition of an object, and that is the form of outer sense. Before concepts are applied a priori, um, subjects acquire things through intuition. We know that was in the introduction. Um, and Kant clearly acknowledges the introduction, so I don't really see why he put this big paragraph here. Maybe to introduce this term immediate representation. I'm not sure. This paragraph seems weird to me. Basically, just restating what intuition does with a weirdly phrased rhetorical question in the beginning. I don't know. Weird academic German writing of the late 1700s, I suppose. Yeah, okay. Intuitions are received, and that reception is what Kant will call an immediate representation. And the form of it is outer sense. Great. So we got some new words that basically just explain nothing that new. Okay. If anyone has any extra commentary or anything on this little paragraph here, let me know. I think it's a bit redundant, and I think my initial interpretation of this beginning question before I had fully, realized what these was saying was much more interesting. But anyway, moving on. Thus, our explanation alone makes the possibility of geometry as aesthetic a priori cognition comprehensible. Any kind of explanation that does not accomplish this, even if it appears to have some similarity with it, can most surely be distinguished from it by means of this characteristic. So let's see. Thus, our explanation alone makes the possibility of geometry a synthetic. So basically, I think he's just summing up what he's saying, what he said earlier, mainly in this paragraph, instead of this weird one right here, that geometry as a synthetic a priori cognition is comprehensible because of space. Oh, yes. Okay. So the possibility of geometry is possible because of the intuition of space. Right. Okay. Yes, space makes geometry possible. Yep. Um, oh, interesting. Maybe that's what he meant. Because before, okay, so before I was saying, Kant thinks that that we don't need perception of object to imagine space. Um, hmm. Maybe did he mean? Huh. I wonder if he considers like geometrical like shapes, or like for example, or even just something like hmm, like a what sort of, oh, Cartesian plane. I wonder if he thinks that's an object, because if he doesn't, he may think it's an intuition. And in that case, yes, space is very much available at objects. Like I don't need to necessarily be thinking of a square or any other shape or anything. And maybe he doesn't mean visually imagine either. Maybe he just means like, yeah, okay. Hmm. Anyway, sorry. I just had this little, I don't know, maybe don't call it an epiphany, but maybe just a moment of clarity or realization. Because, his claim that, so basically he's claiming that geometry is possible because of space. Um, and I was saying, maybe the geometric kind of space, but maybe you can imagine it without geometry or any other geometric objects at all. Maybe you can just not visually, but sort of just abstractly understand space um, as an intuition. Maybe? I don't know. That's a bit strange, but it seems to make more sense than trying to just like imagine some black void or something and be like, oh, that's space, and that's what we were talking about last time. But regardless, Kant thinks that basically what he's saying here at the end, whether that's true or not, because for him, in whatever way he means it, you can imagine space without any objects in it, even geometrical objects. But space is what makes geometrical objects possible, which I suppose in turn makes empirical objects possible, makes an empirical experience possible, right? Or even non-empirical experience. Like if you experience, like it's just geometrical objects, you just think about them, right? Sure, that's you think about them a priori. That's that also maybe counts as experience, non-empirical, a priori. Although I don't know if a priori experience is a good thing to be thinking about, just in terms of like the way they use these words, because usually experience means like empirical, like posteriori experience. Anyway, yeah. So for Kant, geometry is possible. It's a synthetic a priori because of space. Still not sure he gives a good argument as to why it's synthetic, because that sort of relied on geometry. And geometry determines the properties of space. Synthetic. Interesting. It's our explanation alone. An explanation that does not so he goes on to make a pretty beefy claim here. Any kind of explanation that does not accomplish this, even if it appears to have some similarity with it, can most surely be distinguished from it by means of this characteristic. So basically, any other explanation that does not talk about geometry being synthetic a priori through space, and he probably has in mind that of both the rationalist and empiricist, right? They have their own rationalist, very analytic based, definitional based ways of explaining things, especially Spinoza with his like geometric proofs, right? He tries to explain things that way. Haven't fully read Ethics, and I don't know if he explains how space works in there. So, but if he does, that's an alternative explanation Kant might have in mind, or perhaps any empiricist explanation or account of space that might have to do with receiving first something like space empirically, right? Because Kant thinks that we receive space, right? It's an intuition, so we receive it, but it's not empirically received. It is noumenally received, which we'll get into later in the critique. So he is sort of a noumenal empiricist, I guess, Kant. But Kant would still argue against that, it's empirically deduced or given or whatever, because space is necessary for empirical, right up here somewhere, right? Empirical intuition to even be possible. You need the pure intuition of space. So, but it needs to be synthetic as well. So analytic, rationalist explanations aren't going to get the job done for Kant, which I'm still not sure he gives a very strong reason as to why, other than you kind of have to just take it for granted that geometry is synthetic. Space apparently makes geometry possible. So I don't know why. I don't think it's very strong that it's synthetic, but for Kant, it's just not synthetic. So the rationalist won't do it for him, and it is definitely a priori. It's not a posteriori. So the empiricist won't do it for him, and that's what he's basically saying at the end here. It doesn't, it won't do for Kant, in his philosophy. And it can be distinguished from it because it's synthetic a priori. This is distinguished from the rationalist empiricist and any other account that may pop up in the future. This is totally unique and new, and at least that's true and uncontested. Whether you agree with it or not is a whole separate issue. And yes, that pretty much wraps up this section. Don't think there's anything else big to incorporate here. The conclusions from, I believe, both I have to read over this again, but next time we'll get to the conclusions, which should include not only the Transcendental Expedition, but also the metaphysical. So metaphysical, he was kind of going over, right? Just what space is, right? Metaphysically, and then here he talks about how it helps us with our cognition, synthetic a priori, which both a bit controversial. This I think a bit less, but the synthetic thing is still kind of weird. At least in terms of how he argues for it here. Perhaps there are other literature that clears it up or makes it more convincing, but at least how it's given to us right here for the sake of the study, a bit strange, I think. But any comments or disagreements on that or anything, more than welcome and actually encouraged. If there are actually any disagreements or anything like that, or any clarifications. So, yeah, next time we'll do the conclusions from the above concepts from, metaphysical and transcendental expositions of space. We'll do that, and then later on we'll get to the time, and then eventually finish up the transcendental aesthetic. It's actually one of the shortest, bits of the critique compared to the transcendental logic and dialectic and things like that, which are coming much later, and those we'll get into the noumena and the antinomies and all the things that, unity of apperception, the really big Kantian things that are real breakthroughs. Not that these aren't real breakthroughs, and these definitely contribute to the other things, but they're not as big. So it only gets bigger from here. Good thing to look forward to if you're not enjoying so much this part of Kant. So with all that being said, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for the conclusions from the above concepts, which are, once again, the metaphysical and transcendental expositions of the concept of space. So thank you, everybody, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.